Hey everyone, it's time for us to do our next lesson in apologetics. And so we're going to be talking today about evidence for the flood. Proof for not just a local flood, but for a worldwide flood. And just how possible or impossible would it have been for Noah to have been able to be on that ark, build the ark, contain the animals in the ark, the whole storm, evidence for the storm, those types of things as we go through the lesson today. So let's go ahead and get going on it. One of the things you've got to note is that the world is a different world back before the time of the flood. It says in Colbert's book, Evolutionary Growth Rates in the Dinosaurs, in those days the Earth had a tropical or subtropical climate over much of its land surface, and in the widespread tropical lands there was abundance of lush vegetation. He's a scientist. He's talked about dinosaurs, and one of the things he's talked about is the fact that the world would have been so very different. Our current world, we've got the tropical region around the equator, and then we've got a temperate region, and we've got different regions across the earth that cause different types of climates and environments. But back in the times of, before the flood, it would have been very different. The earth shows evidence that tropical climate could have existed everywhere. Unfortunately, the problem with some of the scientific argumentation with the flood is that they base it off of uniformitarianism. And again, to remind you, uniformitarianism is the idea that the earth has always been the same, that the climate of the earth has been consistent, that the rate of decay on animals has been consistent because the environment itself has been consistent, and that forms a problem for anybody because it would argue with the idea of there being a different climate, a different environment on the world before the flood. It also really just doesn't match what we know about our world. Our world doesn't exist in uniformitarianism, that there are local catastrophes and there are worldwide catastrophes. And that even lately, as the scientists, whether you agree or disagree with them, have talked about climate change. Well, that's saying uniformitarianism is not true, yet all of their dating methods rely on uniformitarianism. William Stanfield said several methods have been devised for estimating the age of the earth and its layers of rocks. These methods rely heavily on the assumption of uniformitarianism, defined as natural processes that have proceeded at relatively constant rate throughout the Earth's history. And of course we know that that's not true. Even the scientists who would teach the dating methods and would rely on those for dating the Earth also teach that the Earth has not been in a uniform state since the beginning, and is still in flux. It's still changing in both local and worldwide ways, and so that makes it difficult to really rely on that. The flood, if you're wondering why I'm getting into this again, the flood is the biblical answer as to why uniformitarianism doesn't work. Just the events of the flood, if you look at just how catastrophic the flood would have been to our earth, what a destructive event that would have been, how that would have changed not just the land, but it would have changed just the land, it would have changed the climate, it would have changed everything about our earth. Well, that teaches us that uniformitarianism cannot be true, cannot be something we rely on. Even the Bible teaches that the world was different, that the world, people lived longer. The expanse, what you have in the Bible is that the people, you go back and look at the genealogies of Genesis, and you've got people living hundreds of years to the point of Methuselah. being the oldest man who ever lived, I think lived 989 years. Adam himself lived 930 years. You've got people living 900, 800, 700 years long. Well, that's very different than the way our world works. Instead, you've got a teaching in Genesis chapter 1 that the world is described as being an expanse between the waters. This is Genesis 1 verse 6. An expanse between the waters, separating water from water. That doesn't sound like our world. That sounds different. We'll come back and talk about that in just a moment. The ground itself was primed for growing. You didn't have soil that wasn't really great for growing in the beginning. Even after Adam is kicked out of the garden, I don't know that the soil is acting like soil covered in Roundup. I think you've got just there, it went from everything was so easy in the garden to it being normal. And so he had to work by the sweat of his brow, at least what our normal is. We read in Genesis 2 that at least in the Garden of Eden and possibly everywhere, the water was the ground was watered by water coming up out of the ground, not water coming from the sky, as we tend to think of our world. And so again, you just have a lot of differences in the way the world functioned, and the way the world looks, and the way that the world worked. And so some scientists have proposed a thing called a canopy theory, that this water, the expanse between the waters, is a description of the waters on the earth and the waters above the earth, and that the waters above the earth created this kind of orb around the earth, a canopy, and that's why you had a tropical environment all over the world, because it kind of worked like a greenhouse. It kind of held in all of the moisture, held in all of the heat from the sun, and so you had this outer layer of protection on our world. And of course that changed in the flood. Let's keep going here. We know in the biblical story, God eventually rejects mankind because of their sin. Chapter 6 verse 6 says he was sorry he made them. Chapter 6 verse 6 says he was grieved in his heart. The next verse says he plans to destroy them with a flood. Verse 11 says he despised them for their violence. And so their sin, the fact that their hearts were continually on evil, their sin caused God to react in a severe way, and he sent a flood. And so he caused, if you look at the details here, in chapter 7 and verse 11, here it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the sources of the vast watery depth broke open. After that, it says, the floodgates of the sky open, that there were these places where there was water stored above, and it was open. And then it says that rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. And so you got a massive amount of water coming down. And this can all be explained by the canopy theory. The theory is, if you remember the picture I just showed you, that when the fountains of the deep, this high-pressured hot water, burst out of the ground, think of maybe the different geysers, Old Faithful, how the water will burst out of the ground, that when that water burst out of the ground, because God broke open those fountains of the deep, that water rushed up into the sky and burst the fountain, the canopy, and then the canopy started to fall, and it took about 40 days and 40 nights for that layer of water around the earth to break apart and to fall to the earth, and that caused massive amounts of water to come down from the sky onto the earth. Well, Noah was told to build an ark. An ark is merely another word for a box. It's a box of treated wood. Some of your versions will say gopher wood, and we're not really sure what that is. There's a Hebrew word that's very similar to gopher that maybe is just a discrepancy in the way we've translated the text. But it could just mean treated wood, and then it goes on to explain how it's covered with pitch inside and out. And so maybe there's this different kind of wood that's treated with pitch inside and out. This box would have been massive, using a conservative cubit. And what I mean by that is some people will try to redefine cubit based on maybe they were a little larger people back in those days. So that measurement from fingertip to elbow, maybe instead of being 18 inches, it was 21 inches. And so they'll try to add some space to the ark that way. Even if you don't add space to the ark and you take a small man and you use a conservative cubit, the ark would have been 1.39 million cubic feet. That is the capacity of 522 railroad cars. And you take the length, width, and height dimensions of the ark. Those are the same measurement, the same ratio of measurements that are used by today's shipbuilders to make seaworthy vessels. The reason I point that out is because there's actually multiple flood stories in different cultures, different Asian cultures and Middle Eastern cultures. You have different flood stories that exist. And in those flood stories, the ark looked very different. Some look, one of them looks like a cube. One of them looks more like a sailboat on top of just a platform. And so you have different descriptions of the ark or the boat that saved whoever the hero of the story is in these different cultures. The biblical story is the only one that has what we would call a shipworthy vehicle. A vehicle that actually would have been able to be floating and not be spinning around in the water and not be overcome by any sort of waves. It's the only one that really has the right measurements, which again gives some weight to the biblical story being the accurate story as opposed to some of those other ones. And so God takes Noah and places him and his family and animals into this ark, and they are saved from the massive storm. They are saved from the world of sin. And so God saves Noah from the world with the flood. We always say God saved Noah from the flood with the ark. But in 1 Peter 3:20, Peter makes the point that no, what God saved Noah from was a world of sin. He used the water as the means of salvation for Noah, not as a means of destruction that God had to save Noah from. Just a different perspective there by Peter to try to help us. This is a picture of the ark that's been created up in Kentucky. Just to give you an idea of how large this thing is, we're pretty far away from it. We had to be this far away in order to get a picture of it. And I don't know how well you can see any of the people that are actually close to the ark, but for instance, there's people right there. You can get a sense of how tiny people are in comparison to how large this boat would have been, this box. And so it gives you an idea of just how massive this thing really is. And so there are some who would object to Noah's story, saying that the ark would not have been big enough. What you find is the ark would have been huge, plenty big for animals and storage and living quarters. And I think sometimes we forget that those other things would have been needed. We know the animals had to fit, but Noah had to fit not just animals, but he had to fit storage for food for the animals. He had to fit living quarters, for the people that would have been away from the animals in some way. The storage itself for them to survive over a year on a boat would have been massive needs there for that kind of storage. There could have even been, and I had not thought about this until I went to the ark there in Kentucky, but there could have been a place for gardens, maybe even a greenhouse to grow food for the humans. There would have been those types of needs taken care of if God would have revealed to him how long they would be living on this ark. Others will object that you cannot get 2 of every species aboard. Now again, remember, we don't need 2 of every species the way we define species in our current classification, but you just needed 2 or 7 of every kind. And so Ernst Mayr outlined every creature needed on the ark to lead to what is alive today. And he basically said you would need 3,700 mammals, 8,600 birds, 6,300 reptiles, 2,500 amphibians. You would add up to around 50,000 animals. And if you take the average size of a sheep, which, again, a lot of animals are much smaller than that. Some animals are much bigger than that. Since a boxcar could hold 240 sheep-sized animals, the ark could have held 125,000 sheep-sized animals if it were organized correctly. Well, that's a lot more space than just the 50,000 animals that would have been needed to go on the ark. Now again, Ernst Mayer's estimate is much higher than some other people's estimates, but I'm trying to put the more conservative answer on here so that I'm not just jumping to extremes to try to prove my point. I want it to be an actual answer. Others have objected that Noah would not have had sufficient time to build a boat that large. But again, nowhere did God command Noah to swing every hammer and hit every nail. That wasn't part of the requirement. He just had to build the ark. And so the Bible is pretty mute on how the ark itself was built. I would imagine he could have easily have hired people to come work on the project, even if people thought he was crazy. Even if people thought he was outside his mind, and they would have done the job had they been paid for it. And so it's possible that he could have gotten crews to work on it, but it's also possible he did it himself, he and his 3 sons. And so John Morris wrote a book which detailed the work that would have been necessary for 4 men to complete the job in a regular work time, 6 days a week, and only 81 years, and they had 120 years to do the job. And so maybe that's applicable, maybe it's not. We don't really know all the details of how they built it. We just know they did, and we know that they, took care of obeying God in this way, and they were saved because of it. Noah could not collect those animals by himself. Well, I would agree with that. That would be a very difficult job. But the Bible doesn't say that. It says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 20, 2 of everything, from the birds according to their kind, from the livestock according to their kind, from an animals that crawl on the ground according to their kind, will come to you so that you can keep them alive. And so the Bible answers that question, that God calls the animals to come to Noah, not Noah going out on years of expeditions collecting all these animals to come and live on his ark. Noah could not have fed, watered, or cleaned up after so many animals. Again, can you imagine 50,000 animals in an enclosed space? Just how disgusting that would be, especially, day after day, cleaning up the manure, feeding, watering, making sure that the air was fresh throughout the ark instead of it being a closed-up box. Just how difficult some of that would be. Well, again, that's one of those things I had never really thought of, but it's worth exploring. And that's one of the things that, I realized when I was at the Ark in Kentucky, that they have a display about the different lighting and ventilation and different processes that were available to Noah at the time that he built the ark. If you look at other cultures, the way ships were built, these are some of the things that could have been available. For instance, lighting could have been done by candles, although that does seem dangerous in a big wooden box covered in pitch. But it could have been done by candles or some sort of enclosed glass in order to bring about light in different places. There could have been sunlight through the opening. And most people who look at the ark think that most of the animals would have been on the upper level of the ark and not the lower levels. The lower levels would have been used for either storage or for waste, having waste drop through. in order for it to be cleaned up and then taken out of the ark. But the sunlight through the opening, sunlight through the covering, maybe the covering itself could have lifted up, and that would have allowed them to be able to get into the ark. Ventilation would have been possible through several different methods. One was a pump method based on the movement of the water and the movement of the boat, and how that could have pressed water through the ark. Water and waste could have been done in several different ways. They could have collected rainwater. They could have even at that time, it's possible that the water that filled the earth was fresh water. We had not had time for it to go salty, and therefore very possible that it was just fresh water all around them. So they would have had water in plenty supply. You've got liquid waste removal. What would you have done with all of the urine? What would you have done with all of the feces? There's processes that were available to them to make all of that possible. How much water was needed to cover the earth? Well, again, that depends on how you understand the earth. It's very possible that the earth itself was not hilly, that the earth itself didn't have the large mountain ranges on it, that those mountain ranges came as a result of the flood and as a result of God pushing back the water from the flood. Psalm 104, verses 6 through 9 says, "You covered it with the deep, as if it were a garment. The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, the water fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. Mountains rose and valleys sank to the place you established them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. They will never cross the earth again." And so here the implication is that God created the mountains and valleys as a result of pushing the waters back. And so maybe there wasn't a need for as much water then to cover the earth as we would need today to cover the earth, to get the water over the tip of Mount Everest or those types of mountains. Maybe those mountains were created not only as a result of the movement of the water, but as a result of God pushing the water back. It was his way of making things better. Other proofs of the flood, there are bones of prehistoric whales that have been unearthed in deserts and Chiles. 20 of these skeletons are supposedly intact. And so this has also been found in Peru, been found in Egypt. There are fossils that have been created in a very sudden manner. For instance, this fish that supposedly got killed while in the process of eating another fish. Again, I don't know enough about fossils and how to read these things to say anything definitely, but there are a lot of fossils that seem to be frozen, just killed in a very sudden moment and fossilized in a sudden moment, and that it would only happen if the animal were killed and buried all at the same time, and the circumstances were made so that animal could be preserved in the fossil record for us. Animal graveyards have been found throughout the whole earth. We saw that in our dinosaur lesson, how there were large concentrations of dinosaurs' bones in certain places of the earth. That same thing is true of other animals. There are some animals that will do that on purpose, like elephants, but there are a lot of animals that they just were all washed into the same place. Geological strata are upside down in many places. We mentioned that in a previous lesson. That could be explained by the flood. Fossilized sea creatures high above sea levels, like shellfish found in the Himalayas, and marine fossils found in the Grand Canyon. And so how did those sea creatures get there? My kids have even found shark's teeth in the creek behind our house, and we're way up on a mountain in Alabama. And so, how did that kind of sea creature, sea evidence, how is that found in such high places, unless those high places were covered with water at some point? It's interesting to me that scientists will argue with the flood, but they don't argue with the ice age. And so one of the things that could have happened is that God could have caused the catastrophic flood, and that the catastrophic flood is actually the changing of environment that they see that makes them believe an ice age happened. So it could be that the ice age happened, but it happened not with ice and didn't happen as long ago as they think it happened. It wasn't a natural, slow, gradual thing that lasted hundreds of years, but rather it is a catastrophic event that lasted a year, and that the evidence from the flood, which would explain some of the water damage in different places that they attribute to ice. It could explain the changing of the species and the disbursement of the species. Could help explain the disbursement of humankind even. All of the things that are used to talk about the Ice Age could have been really just evidence of the flood that they're interpreting through the lens of natural events instead of a supernatural event, the way we can as Christians. Hopefully this lesson has been helpful to you in trying to understand that there is plenty of evidence out there for believing in a flood. We could, of course, go through so many more pieces of evidence, but these are just here to, at least for your consideration, as you think about the flood and whether those events truly are events that happened on our earth, or do we have good physical evidence for believing in what our Bible teaches about such a catastrophic event in our world.